It was a quiet afternoon in Texas when a woman named Maggie Dawson pushed open the door of a small-town gun store. The bell above the door jingled softly as she walked in. The smell of gun oil and metal filled the air, and the sound of laughter came from a group of young men near the counter. Maggie looked out of place among them. Her silver-gray hair was tied neatly in a ponytail, and she wore a simple denim jacket and a pair of old boots that had clearly seen better days. But behind those calm, kind eyes was something no one there could guess. She slowly walked toward the display of rifles, studying each one with a focused gaze. The store clerk, a young man in his 20s, barely looked up from his phone. When she asked politely to see one of the long-range rifles, he gave a small smirk and said, "Ma'am, are you sure? This one's a bit heavy." The other men near the counter laughed quietly among themselves. One of them whispered, "Maybe she's buying it for her grandson." Maggie didn't respond. She only gave a small smile and nodded for the clerk to hand her the gun. Her hands, though aged, were steady as she checked the scope and the trigger. She looked completely at ease, like someone who had done this 100 times before. The laughter behind her didn't bother her. She had faced far worse things in her life than a few arrogant boys with bad manners. After examining the rifle, Maggie turned to the clerk and asked if she could try it out on the range behind the store. The man looked surprised but agreed. As she filled out the range waiver, the group of young men followed, whispering and joking under their breath. One of them laughed loudly and said, "Hope she doesn't shoot her foot off." Maggie heard every word but kept silent. Her calmness only seemed to amuse them more. When she reached the shooting lane, she set the rifle down carefully and adjusted her position. The men gathered behind the glass wall, eager to watch what they thought would be a funny scene. The instructor on duty, an ex-Marine named Tom, noticed the crowd and walked over to see what was going on. "Everything okay here, ma'am?" he asked politely. "Everything's fine," Maggie replied with a gentle smile. "Just haven't fired one of these in a while." She took a deep breath and began to adjust the rifle with slow, practiced movements. She checked the sight alignment, adjusted the bipod, and lay down in perfect prone position. Tom raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't something you learned from watching YouTube videos, that was real training." The laughter continued faintly behind her. Maggie didn't look back. She closed one eye, focused through the scope, and took another deep breath. In that moment, she wasn't a 67-year-old woman anymore. She wasn't a target of mockery or someone being underestimated. She was a shooter, calm, focused, and confident. The trigger moved back smoothly under her finger. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the range. When the target came back, there was a small hole directly in the center, a perfect bullseye. The laughter stopped instantly. Tom stared at the paper, then at Maggie, unsure if what he saw was real. She didn't react. She simply loaded another round, adjusted slightly for wind, and fired again. The second bullet went through the same hole. The men watching from behind the glass exchanged shocked looks. Not a word came out of their mouths now. Maggie fired a few more shots, each one just as accurate as the last. Her movements were smooth, almost graceful. Every action was deliberate, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Tom couldn't help but ask, "Ma'am, have you done this before?" Maggie looked up with a small, knowing smile. "A long time ago," she said quietly. The young men who had laughed at her earlier stood frozen. The smirks had vanished, replaced by wide eyes and open mouths. They had come to see an old lady make a fool of herself. Instead, they had witnessed something extraordinary. As Maggie finished her rounds, she stood up slowly and handed the rifle back to the instructor. "Thank you for letting me use your range," she said politely. Her voice was calm, but there was a certain strength in it, the kind that comes from years of experience, discipline, and quiet confidence. Tom nodded, still a bit stunned. "Ma'am, that was some of the best shooting I've ever seen." She smiled softly. "Just a bit of old training, that's all." When she walked out of the store, no one dared to laugh again. The same people who had mocked her just an hour ago now watched in silence, as if realizing they had just seen something rare. They didn't know who she really was or where she had learned to shoot like that, but deep down, They could feel there was a story behind those steady hands and calm eyes. As Maggie stepped into the sunlight and headed toward her truck, she didn't look back once. The sound of the door closing behind her was the only thing that broke the silence inside the store. For the first time that day, everyone there understood that age doesn't define skill, and respect should never depend on appearances. They had laughed when she walked in, but by the time she left, not one of them dared to make a sound. The sound of Maggie's first perfect shots had left the store silent, but the next day, some of the young men who had witnessed it still couldn't accept what they saw. They gathered again at the gun store, laughing and making excuses. "She probably got lucky," one said. "Anyone can hit once or twice," another added. None of them wanted to admit that a 67-year-old woman had done something they couldn't. That afternoon, Maggie returned to the store. She wanted to practice again, not for show, but for herself. Shooting wasn't a game to her, it was a part of who she was. When she walked in, the same group was there. The same clerk stood behind the counter. He recognized her immediately, and though he looked slightly embarrassed, he still greeted her awkwardly. "Back again, ma'am?" he said, half joking. "Yes," Maggie replied with a kind smile. "I'd like to use the long-range rifle again, if that's all right." The clerk hesitated for a second, then handed it over. The young men nearby chuckled. One of them whispered loudly, "Guess Grandma's got nothing better to do." Maggie heard it, but she didn't react. Instead, she checked the rifle carefully, like she always did, testing the bolt, cleaning the barrel, adjusting the sight. Every movement she made was calm and precise. When she walked toward the range, the laughter grew. "Maybe she'll show us her magic aim again," one said sarcastically. The others joined in. But this time, the range instructor, Tom, was already there. He gave the young men a sharp look. "You boys ever hit a bullseye at 500 yards? He asked. They went quiet for a second. "Not yet," one muttered. "Then you might want to watch and learn instead of laugh," Tom said firmly. Maggie took her place at the far end of the range. She set the rifle down, adjusted the bipod, and lay down flat, her cheek resting gently against the stock. She didn't rush, she never did. Her breathing slowed, her focus sharpened, and the noise behind her faded into nothing. For her, it was just her, the rifle, and the target. The first shot rang out. Perfect bullseye. The second followed right through the first hole. The third hit exactly where she wanted, not by chance, but by skill. The group behind the glass watched in stunned silence as she fired round after round, each one flawless. Tom crossed his arms, a small grin forming on his face. "That's no luck," he said quietly. "That's training." When Maggie finished, she stood up slowly and looked through the window at the group of young men. She gave them a small, polite nod, not of pride, but of quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need words. One of the young men finally walked up, trying to hide his embarrassment. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, "how do you do that? You make it look easy." Maggie smiled softly. "It's not easy," she said. "You just need patience. And respect, for the weapon, for yourself, and for the moment." Her voice carried a calm authority that made everyone listen. She didn't scold them or boast. She simply spoke as if teaching a life lesson, one earned through experience, not age. After a moment, she added, "The gun doesn't care how old you are. It only listens to how calm you are." Those words stayed with them long after she left that day. But as the crowd began to talk again, one of the men, the same one who mocked her the most, noticed something strange. When she packed her things, he saw a small, faded patch stitched on her shooting bag. It was old and worn, but the words were still visible, U.S. Army, Special Operations Command. He froze for a second, staring at it. "Hey," he said to Tom. "Was she in the Army?" Tom nodded slowly. "More than that. I think she was one of the best." The room went quiet again. The laughter stopped, replaced by awe and a little guilt. They realized they hadn't just made fun of an old woman. They had laughed at someone who had probably seen more danger and courage than they ever would. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the Texas hills, Maggie sat in her truck in the parking lot, staring out at the horizon. The orange light glowed on her face. She wasn't angry about what happened. She was used to being underestimated. In her younger days, she had faced worse, being the only woman in a unit full of men. She had learned long ago that true respect isn't demanded. It's earned quietly, through actions, not words. The young men, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about her. The image of that steady hand, that perfect aim, and that quiet confidence replayed in their minds. Some of them returned the next day, asking Tom about training. They wanted to learn to shoot properly, not to compete, but to understand. Tom told them, "You can't teach focus overnight. But if you pay attention, you might learn something from watching her." And that's exactly what happened. Each time Maggie came to the range, the laughter grew quieter and the respect grew louder. Slowly, the same people who mocked her began to stand aside when she entered. Some even greeted her politely, with a nod or a smile. They still didn't know the full story, not yet. They didn't know why she handled a rifle like a soldier, or why her eyes carried that calm, distant strength. But they knew one thing for sure. The woman they had once mocked had something they didn't: mastery, patience, and a quiet kind of power that comes only from a life well lived. By the end of that week, no one dared to call her grandma again. They had all seen the truth, that age doesn't weaken greatness. It reveals it. The sun was high over the small Texas town when Maggie Dawson walked once again into the gun range. The place had become a quiet battlefield of pride and curiosity ever since she first showed her incredible skill. Word had spread fast about the elderly woman who hit bullseyes with the precision of a sniper. Some believed it, others thought it was exaggerated. But everyone wanted to see for themselves. That day, the range was busier than usual. The same young men who once laughed at her stood watching, pretending they weren't waiting for her to arrive. When the doorbell chimed and Maggie stepped in, conversations paused for a second. Her calm, steady steps echoed lightly across the floor as she walked to the counter. She wore the same denim jacket and carried her old shooting bag, the one with the faded army patch stitched to the side. The clerk straightened up quickly this time. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said with genuine respect now. Maggie gave him a polite nod. "Afternoon. I'd like to practice again if it's all right." "Of course," he replied, already preparing her usual rifle. The group near the counter whispered among themselves. "That's her," one of them said. "The old lady who hit every shot dead center." But still, a few doubters smirked quietly. "It's just talk," one said. "Nobody's that good." Maggie didn't look their way. She walked toward the range, her calm presence commanding quiet wherever she moved. The instructor, Tom, noticed her coming and smiled faintly. "Ready for another round, Miss Dawson?" "Always," she replied softly. She set up her equipment with careful precision. Every movement had a rhythm, a purpose. The way she opened the rifle case, checked the barrel, aligned the scope, and adjusted her stance. The young men crowded behind the glass wall again, but this time their laughter was replaced by a tense silence. They wanted to see if the legend was true. Maggie took her position on the mat. Her breathing slowed. The world around her seemed to fade away. The voices, the noise, the movement. Everything disappeared until there was only her and the distant target. Her heartbeat synchronized with her breath. It was a feeling she knew well. Years ago, she had felt the same focus on battlefields far away, where one wrong breath could mean the difference between life and death. She placed her finger gently on the trigger. The sound of the rifle cracked through the air like thunder. The echo bounced off the concrete walls of the range. The target rolled back slowly, stopping in front of the glass. A perfect bullseye, a clean, single hole straight through the center. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, almost unreal. Then Maggie loaded another round, calm as ever, and fired again. The second bullet tore through the same hole. Someone in the back let out a soft gasp. The instructor Tom leaned closer, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. He had trained hundreds of shooters, both civilians and soldiers, but this level of control and accuracy was rare, incredibly rare. Shot after shot, Maggie continued. Each one landed exactly where she intended. The paper target looked untouched except for that single hole that grew slightly larger from precision, not from error. When she finally stopped, she unloaded the rifle, set it aside, and stood up. Her expression was peaceful, no pride, no arrogance, just quiet satisfaction. Tom stepped forward and examined the target closely. "Ma'am," he said slowly, turning to her. "I've never seen anyone shoot like that." Maggie smiled faintly. "It's all about patience," she said. "You take your time, trust your instincts, and respect the weapon." The group behind the glass finally began to murmur in awe. "Did you see that?" one whispered. "Every shot. The same spot." Another shook his head. "That's impossible." But they all knew it wasn't impossible. It was real. They had seen it with their own eyes. The atmosphere in the store had completely changed. The same place that once echoed with mocking laughter was now filled with quiet respect. Even the cocky young men who had joked about her before now stood frozen, watching her with wide eyes. One of them, unable to hold back his curiosity, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "how long have you been shooting like that?" Maggie looked at him kindly. "Long enough," she replied softly. "But remember, it's not how long you've done something. It's how much you care about doing it right." Her words hit harder than her shots. There was wisdom in her tone, the kind that only comes from experience, and from seeing both life and loss through the scope of a rifle. Tom looked at her again, more curious now. "If you don't mind me asking, were you military?" Maggie hesitated for a second, then nodded slightly. "Once," she said. "A long time ago." That was all she said. She didn't brag. She didn't share stories. She simply packed up her rifle, zipped her bag, and started to leave. As she walked toward the door, one of the men whispered, "She's like something out of a movie." Tom shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "She's real. And she's the kind of person you don't forget." Outside, the Texas sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Maggie paused for a moment, looking at the horizon. She felt peaceful. She didn't need recognition or applause. The silence inside the store was more than enough. It was the silence of respect. Inside, no one laughed anymore. The sound of her shots still echoed in their minds, sharp, steady, unforgettable. The young men who once mocked her now stood humbled, realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. For them, it was just a day at the range. For Maggie, it was another quiet reminder that true strength doesn't fade with age. It deepens. By the time she drove away, every person in that store had learned a lesson they'd never forget. You can mock someone's years, but you can't measure the power of experience. The next morning, the story of the mysterious old woman at the gun store spread through town like wildfire. People couldn't stop talking about her. The men who had laughed at her the first day were now the ones describing her every move, the way she held the rifle, how she aimed, and how every bullet hit the exact same spot. Some said it was luck, but most knew it was something more. By noon, the gun store had become a local hotspot. Regular customers came not to buy guns, but to ask questions. Who was she? Where did she learn to shoot like that? Is she a professional? No one really knew. The clerk only shrugged and said, "Her name's Maggie Dawson. That's all I know." But not everyone was a stranger to that name. That afternoon, a man named Frank Miller walked into the store. He was a quiet man, about 60, wearing an old army cap. He had been a soldier once, long ago. When he heard the rumors about an older woman shooting with perfect precision, something clicked in his mind. "What did you say her name was?" he asked the clerk. "Maggie Dawson," the clerk replied. Frank froze. His eyes widened slightly. "Did you say Captain Margaret Dawson?" The clerk looked confused. "I don't know about Captain, sir. Just Maggie Dawson. Older lady. Silver hair. Calm as a stone. Shoots like a machine." Frank didn't say another word for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and whispered to himself, "I'll be damned. She's still alive." Everyone turned to look at him. "You know her?" one of the young men asked. Frank smiled faintly. "Know her? Son, that woman saved my life once." The room went silent. Even the ones who had laughed before now leaned forward, curious. Frank pulled out a chair and sat down, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It was back in '93, he began. We were in a rough zone overseas, Operation Iron Shield. I was part of a small recon unit. We were pinned down for 2 days, no backup, low ammo. We thought it was over. Then, out of nowhere, someone started taking out the enemy one by one from over 700 yards away. Clean, perfect shots. Every target dropped before they even knew what hit them. He paused, his eyes distant, as if he could still see it happening. When the shooting stopped and we finally made it out, we found out who our guardian angel was. A sniper named Captain Margaret Dawson. The best shot in the entire operation. She was calm, quiet, and deadly accurate. Some soldiers called her the Silver Hawk. She never missed. The young men around him listened in awe. That's her? One whispered. That's the same woman? Frank nodded slowly. No doubt about it. That kind of precision doesn't come from practice. It comes from years of experience, discipline, and nerves of steel. She's a legend, even if she never wanted to be one. Tom, the range instructor who had been listening quietly, spoke up. She never mentioned any of that, he said softly. She just came in, shot, and left. Didn't say a word about her past. Frank smiled. That's just how she is. Never liked attention. She believed respect should be earned quietly, not demanded loudly. The room stayed silent for a while. Everyone was lost in thought. The image of that calm old woman now looked completely different in their minds. She wasn't just an elderly shooter showing off her skill. She was a war hero, a decorated sniper who had once risked her life to protect others. That evening, when Maggie returned to the range, everyone treated her differently. There were no whispers or laughter this time. The moment she walked in, the young men straightened up. Tom greeted her respectfully. Good to see you again, Ms. Dawson, he said. Good to be back, she replied, unaware of what everyone now knew. As she prepared her rifle, the crowd stayed quiet, watching in silence. Even Frank was there, standing at the back, his cap in his hands. When Maggie finished her shooting session and started packing up, Frank slowly walked toward her. Captain Dawson? He said softly. Maggie looked up, surprised. Few people had called her that name in years. She studied his face for a moment, and then her eyes softened. Sergeant Miller? Frank smiled. You remember. Of course, she said kindly. You were in Unit Delta. You were injured during Iron Shield. He nodded. Yeah, and you're the reason I made it home. I never got to thank you. Maggie shook her head gently. You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job. But Frank's eyes glistened. You did more than that. You saved lives, mine included. For a moment, the entire room stood still, watching the reunion between two soldiers who shared a past of courage and pain. The young men who had once mocked her now saw something they'd never seen before, true strength. Not the kind that came from muscles or bravado, but the kind that came from honor, discipline, and sacrifice. Before leaving, Frank turned to the others and said, That woman right there? She's a living legend. And you'd all do well to remember. Respect doesn't come from age, gender, or looks. It comes from what a person's done when it mattered most. Maggie simply smiled, picked up her bag, and walked out quietly, just as she always did. She didn't need the applause or the admiration. Her heart was peaceful, because she had never done any of it for fame. She had done it for duty, and that was enough. After that day, no one at the store ever joked about her again. Her name carried a new kind of weight, not because of her past, but because of what she represented. Strength, humility, and respect earned through action, not words. By the time the sun went down, the whispers about Maggie Dawson had changed. No longer was she the old lady with a gun. She was Captain Margaret Dawson, the Silver Hawk, the woman who once protected her country and now, unknowingly, taught an entire town a lesson in respect. The next morning, the town was still buzzing with talk about Maggie Dawson. Her story had reached farther than anyone expected. Not just around the gun store, but across nearby towns, through veterans groups, and even onto social media. People were sharing stories about her, and pictures of her shooting target had spread online, showing every bullet in the same exact spot. But what truly caught attention was the name, Captain Margaret Dawson, a name that hadn't been heard publicly in years. Somewhere far away in a large military base, that name reached the ears of someone who remembered it very well. General Robert Hayes, a tall, gray-haired man known for his strict discipline and sharp mind, sat in his office looking at a message on his computer. It was a short report from a veteran friend in Texas. "You won't believe this, sir. Captain Dawson showed up at a small gun range yesterday. She's alive. She's still shooting like she never left the field." General Hayes leaned back in his chair, speechless. "Captain Dawson," he repeated softly, almost to himself. He hadn't heard that name since the old days of Operation Iron Shield, when Maggie had been one of the most skilled and respected snipers under his command. She had retired quietly years ago, refusing medals, attention, or interviews. She had disappeared from military circles completely. Without thinking twice, Hayes picked up the phone. "Get the car ready," he told his assistant. "We're going to Texas." The drive took several hours, but Hayes didn't mind. His thoughts were full of memories, of long nights in dangerous territory, of the sound of Maggie's calm voice on the radio, saying target neutralized with her usual quiet confidence. She was never loud, never proud, just efficient, professional, a true soldier. When he finally arrived at the small gun store, his black SUV pulled into the parking lot, drawing everyone's attention. The young men inside looked through the window in surprise. The man who stepped out wasn't just anyone. His presence alone demanded respect. Tom, the instructor, came forward nervously as the general walked in. "Sir, can I help you?" "I'm looking for Captain Margaret Dawson," Hayes said firmly. Tom blinked, then nodded toward the range room. "She's here, sir. Lane 5. The general walked toward the glass window separating the range from the store. Through it, he saw Maggie, lying on the mat, calm and steady, her silver hair shining under the bright light. She was in perfect shooting form, her rifle balanced with care, her breathing slow and controlled. Hayes stood silently for a moment, watching her work. Every movement was familiar, the same discipline, the same focus. It was like watching a piece of history come alive again. When she fired her last shot, Maggie stood up and turned toward the door. That's when she saw him. At first, she froze, unable to believe her eyes. "General Hayes?" she said softly, lowering her rifle. He smiled warmly. "Captain Dawson," he replied. "It's been a long time." For a moment, the room went completely silent. Everyone there, the young shooters, the clerks, even Tom, just stood watching in awe as a real army general walked toward the woman they once mocked. Maggie smiled faintly. "I didn't think anyone from those days remembered me," she said. "Remember you?" Hayes chuckled. "I don't think anyone who served with you could ever forget you. You were one of the best soldiers I ever commanded." She looked down humbly. "That was a long time ago, sir. I'm just an old woman now, keeping my hands steady." But Hayes shook his head firmly. "You're not just an old woman, Maggie. You're a soldier who never lost her spirit." Then, to everyone's shock, General Hayes took off his cap and saluted her. The store went completely silent. No one dared to move. The same young men who once whispered and laughed now stood frozen, their eyes wide. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A powerful, high-ranking army general saluting the same woman they had mocked. Maggie looked surprised, then quickly stood straighter, returning the salute with quiet dignity. The moment was powerful, filled with deep respect that words couldn't express. "Ma'am," Hayes said with pride in his voice, "on behalf of every soldier you've ever protected and every mission you've ever completed, thank you." Her eyes glistened slightly, but she stayed composed. "I just did what had to be done," she replied softly. Hayes smiled. "That's exactly why we all respected you so much. You never wanted recognition. You just wanted results." The young men finally understood who she really was. Not just a skilled shooter, but a true hero who had served her country with quiet courage. One of them whispered, "She's a legend." After a few more words, Hayes turned to the group and said, "Gentlemen, This woman right here carried more bravery in one mission than most people carry in a lifetime. Don't ever judge someone by what they look like. You never know what they've done for the world. Everyone nodded silently, some even feeling ashamed for ever doubting her. Before leaving, Hayes placed his hand on Maggie's shoulder. You should come visit the base sometime. The young recruits could learn a thing or two from you. Maggie chuckled softly. I think I've done enough teaching for one lifetime, sir. Maybe, Hayes said with a grin. But heroes like you never really retire. He gave her one last respectful salute before leaving. The door closed behind him, and for a few seconds, the store remained utterly still. Then slowly people began to clap. Not loud, not exaggerated, just soft, genuine applause from every person in the room. Maggie smiled gently, her eyes lowering to the floor, humbled. She hadn't come there to impress anyone, only to keep her skills alive. But now, without meaning to, she had reminded everyone that true greatness doesn't shout. It whispers quietly through actions that speak louder than words. As she packed her rifle and walked out into the warm evening air, the young men watched her go with newfound respect. In their eyes, she wasn't just a woman anymore. She was a warrior, a protector, and a living reminder that honor has no age limit. When General Hayes left the gun store that day, the air felt heavy with emotion. Everyone stood in silence for a long moment after the door closed. No one could believe what they had just seen. The same woman they had mocked for her age had just been saluted by a decorated army general. Something only true heroes ever earned. Tom, the instructor, looked down at his shoes, embarrassed. The laughter, the teasing, the judgment. All of it now seemed childish and cruel. The young men who once whispered behind Maggie's back were completely speechless. They had seen something rare, something real, respect earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. Maggie quietly began packing her things. She handled her rifle with care, cleaning it, dismantling it piece by piece, her movements calm and precise. There was no pride in her eyes, no arrogance. She didn't smile because she had proved anyone wrong. Instead, there was peace, the kind of peace that comes when truth finally reveals itself. Tom finally found the courage to speak. Mrs. Dawson, he said softly. I'm sorry. We didn't know who you were. Maggie looked up, smiling faintly. You didn't have to know, she replied kindly. Respect shouldn't depend on someone's past. It should come from how you treat people right now. Her words hit everyone deeply. They all nodded slowly, realizing how true that was. Respect, they now understood, wasn't something you gave based on age, looks, or status. It was something every person deserved until they proved otherwise. Outside, the afternoon sun was glowing softly, painting golden light across the small town. Maggie stepped out of the store, her steps slow but steady. Every person in the room followed her silently to the door. For the first time, they didn't see a fragile old woman. They saw a soldier walking tall, her spirit unbroken. Tom called out to her as she reached her car. Ma'am, would you maybe come back sometime? You could teach us a few things. The way you handle that rifle. It's something special. Maggie turned around, her expression thoughtful. Maybe someday, she said with a gentle smile. But remember, shooting isn't just about the gun. It's about focus, patience, and control. Most people miss not because they can't aim, but because they don't breathe right. Her advice was simple yet powerful. Tom and the others listened carefully, realizing they were learning not just from a shooter, but from someone who had mastered both her skill and her spirit. As Maggie drove away, the young men stood quietly for a while. One of them whispered, "Did you see how the general saluted her?" Tom nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That wasn't just respect. That was honor. You don't salute someone like that unless they've earned it, the hard way." Over the next few days, news of the incident spread through town. People who had seen the video, a short clip someone had accidentally recorded, began talking about the old lady who made a general salute. The video went viral, shared millions of times. But unlike most viral stories, this one wasn't funny or sensational. It was inspiring. People left comments like, True strength never fades. That's real discipline right there. We need more people like her in this world. Maggie didn't even know her video had become famous. She wasn't on social media, and she didn't care much for fame. She spent her days in peace, tending her small garden, cleaning her rifle, and sometimes visiting the local park to feed the birds. One evening, she received a letter in the mail. The envelope had a gold military seal on it. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a handwritten note. Captain Dawson, your quiet courage has reminded us what true service looks like. The general has recommended you for an honorary medal ceremony at the base. We hope you will attend. U.S. Army Command. For a long moment, Maggie just sat there, staring at the letter. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She hadn't expected recognition. She never wanted it. But somewhere deep inside, it warmed her heart to know that she hadn't been forgotten. The following week, she decided to go. When she arrived at the base, dozens of soldiers stood in formation. The same General Hayes walked up to her, smiling with pride. You came, he said. I almost didn't, she admitted softly. I don't like attention, he chuckled. You deserve this more than anyone here. As she stood before the soldiers, Hayes turned to the crowd and said, This woman is a living reminder of what real strength and discipline mean. She taught us that honor doesn't age, it only grows stronger. Then, once again, he saluted her, this time in front of everyone. Every soldier followed his lead. The sound of hundreds of boots striking the ground echoed across the field as they saluted Maggie Dawson in unison. Tears filled many eyes. The air was thick with respect, the kind that could not be faked. Maggie stood tall, her eyes glistening but proud. For the first time in years, she felt the familiar sense of unity, that invisible bond that connected all soldiers who had ever served. After the ceremony, young recruits gathered around her, asking questions, eager to learn. She smiled at them and said, Remember, strength isn't just about muscles or weapons. It's about staying calm when everything around you is falling apart. It's about never giving up, even when no one believes in you. Those words stayed with them long after she left. When Maggie finally returned home that night, she looked at her medals, her rifle, and then out the window toward the stars. She whispered softly, It's not about glory, it's about duty. And though the world now knew her as a hero, she remained the same humble, strong-hearted woman, proving that true greatness doesn't demand attention. It earns it quietly through courage, humility, and heart. The morning after the medal ceremony, Maggie Dawson woke up to a quiet sunrise. The soft light filtered through her window, touching the edges of her medals that now rested on the table beside her bed. They sparkled faintly, not with pride, but with memories. Each one carried a story, a sacrifice, and a reminder of the people she had once fought beside. She got up slowly, her knees stiff but her heart light. For the first time in many years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, peace mixed with purpose. The ceremony had awakened something inside her. It wasn't fame or attention that mattered, but the idea that young soldiers were still willing to learn from her. After breakfast, Maggie went outside to water her plants. The air was cool, filled with the smell of earth and grass. She smiled as she remembered the soldiers' faces, their eyes full of admiration and respect. The salute they gave her had touched her deeply. It wasn't just an act of ceremony. It was gratitude from a new generation to an old warrior who had never stopped believing in duty. A knock came at her door. When she opened it, Tom, the instructor from the gun store, stood there nervously holding a folded piece of paper. "Good morning, ma'am," he said respectfully. "Sorry to bother you. I just wanted to show you something." He handed her the paper. It was a flyer with a picture of her from the medal ceremony, standing tall, holding the medal and smiling faintly. Across the top were the words, "A hero among us, Maggie Dawson Day." Maggie blinked, surprised. "What is this?" Tom smiled. "The town council wanted to honor you. They're planning an event this weekend. People from all over are coming to see you, veterans, students, families. They want to thank you personally." Maggie shook her head gently. "Oh no, that's too much. I'm no hero, Tom. But he looked her in the eyes and said firmly, Ma'am, you may not see yourself that way, but you've reminded everyone what true courage looks like. You've given people hope again. She hesitated, unsure. She had never liked public attention. Yet, she could feel how deeply her story had touched people, and maybe, just maybe, she could use this chance to inspire others. That weekend, the town square was decorated with flags and banners. People from every age gathered, holding small signs that read things like, Respect our heroes, and Strength has no age. There were even young girls wearing camouflage caps, saying they wanted to be strong like Miss Maggie. When Maggie arrived, the crowd erupted in applause. She felt overwhelmed at first, her heart pounding. She had faced danger, bullets, and war zones, but standing before a cheering crowd made her far more nervous. Mayor Collins walked up to her with a kind smile. Mrs. Dawson, it's our honor to dedicate this day to you. You've shown this community, and the whole world, that true strength lives quietly in the hearts of the brave. She was handed a microphone, but for a moment, she didn't know what to say. The faces looking back at her were full of admiration and curiosity. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice calm and steady. I'm not a hero, she said softly. I'm just someone who believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. You don't need a uniform to be brave. You just need courage to stand for something bigger than yourself. The crowd listened silently, hanging on every word. She continued, When I was younger, I learned that the strongest people aren't the loudest. They're the ones who keep going when nobody is watching. They don't do it for medals or applause. They do it because they care. Her words touched everyone deeply. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others nodded with quiet respect. Then she looked toward a group of young soldiers standing in the crowd. You, she said, pointing gently toward them. You are the future. You carry the spirit of every soldier who came before you. Never forget, it's not the gun that makes you strong. It's your heart, your discipline, and your honor. The crowd burst into applause again, louder this time. Even the toughest men in uniform had tears glistening in their eyes. After her speech, many people came to meet her, families, children, even reporters. She smiled and shook hands, though she felt shy about all the attention. One little girl, about 10 years old, came forward holding a small toy rifle. She looked up at Maggie and asked innocently, Miss Maggie, can girls be soldiers too? Maggie knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. Of course they can, sweetheart. A soldier isn't about being a boy or a girl. It's about being brave, smart, and kind. You can be anything you want. Just never let anyone tell you that you can't. The girl hugged her tightly, and for a brief moment, Maggie's eyes filled with emotion. She realized then that her story wasn't just about her anymore. It was about inspiring others to believe in themselves. Later that evening, as the crowd began to leave, General Hayes approached her once more. He smiled and said, You've started something big here, Captain. People needed this reminder. Maggie chuckled softly. I didn't plan to start anything, General. I just wanted to shoot in peace. He laughed. Sometimes, the smallest actions create the loudest echoes. As the sun set, the sky painted shades of orange and gold across the horizon. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Maggie standing quietly in the square, watching the flags wave gently in the evening breeze. She felt content. Not because of the praise, but because she had used her story to bring hope. She had turned years of silence into a voice that could guide others. That night, as she sat by her window, she whispered softly, Maybe this was the real mission all along. Not fighting battles, but reminding people what true strength means. And with that thought, Maggie smiled peacefully, the light of the medals reflecting faintly on her wall. Not symbols of war, but of courage, humility, and the timeless power of honor. After Maggie Dawson's special day, the one her town called a hero among us, life began to settle back into its peaceful rhythm. The banners came down, the crowds went home, and the noise faded away. But something inside Maggie had quietly changed. For many years, she had lived in silence, keeping her past locked away. Now the world knew her story, and instead of feeling exposed, she felt free. She spent her mornings the same way she always did, watering her flowers, feeding the birds, and cleaning her old rifle with gentle care. But there was a new lightness in her steps. Every once in a while, she would receive letters from people she'd never met. Soldiers, students, teachers, even children, all thanking her for her courage and wisdom. Some wrote, "You made me believe in myself again." Others said, "Your story helped me stand tall when people laughed at me." Each letter reminded her that courage didn't end when a battle was over. It could still touch lives years later in quiet ways. One cool autumn morning, Maggie received an envelope marked with the Army seal once again. Inside was a handwritten invitation from General Hayes himself. It read, "Captain Dawson, we are opening a new training center for young soldiers, and we would be honored if you would attend the opening ceremony. The center will bear your name, the Dawson Academy for Precision and Honor." For a long moment, she couldn't move. Her eyes softened as she read the words again. They were naming a military academy after her, not for fame, not for rank, but for the values she had lived by. It was the highest form of respect she could imagine. She smiled faintly. "The Dawson Academy," she whispered to herself. Who would have thought? A few weeks later, Maggie traveled to the base for the ceremony. She wore a simple dark coat, her medals pinned neatly on her chest. When she arrived, hundreds of young recruits stood lined up, their uniforms spotless, their boots shining. A massive sign behind them read, "Welcome to the Dawson Academy, where honor lives forever." General Hayes greeted her with a proud smile. "Captain, we couldn't think of a better name for this place. You've inspired a whole new generation." Maggie looked around, her heart swelling with emotion. "I only hope they remember why they wear the uniform," she said softly. "Not for pride, not for power, but for service." As she walked along the training grounds, she saw young soldiers practicing their marksmanship. Each one held their rifle carefully, breathing deeply, focusing, just as she had once done. It brought a small smile to her face. She noticed one young man struggling to steady his aim. Without thinking, she walked over. "Mind if I help?" she asked kindly. The soldier froze. "Ma'am, you're Captain Dawson," he stammered. She chuckled. "That's what they tell me." She gently adjusted his posture. "Don't fight the rifle," she said. "Let it become part of you. Control your breath. When your heart feels calm, that's when you take the shot." He followed her advice, and his next shot hit the center of the target. His eyes widened with excitement. "I did it." Maggie smiled proudly. "You did. Remember that feeling, calm, steady, patient. That's what wins battles, not anger or fear." Word spread quickly that Captain Dawson herself was on the field, teaching soldiers. Before long, a small crowd of recruits gathered around her, eager to listen. She shared small lessons not about weapons but about mindset. "War isn't just fought with guns," she told them. "It's fought with discipline. Out there, chaos will try to shake you. Fear will whisper in your ear. But if you stay calm, if you remember your purpose, you'll make it through." The soldiers hung on every word. Some took notes. Others simply watched her, realizing that this woman, quiet, humble, calm, carried the strength of 100 soldiers within her. Later that day, the ceremony began. The national anthem played, and the flags waved proudly in the wind. General Hayes stepped up to the podium. "Today, we honor not just a soldier, but a symbol of what true strength means," he said. Captain Maggie Dawson showed the world that courage has no age, no limit, and no end. He turned toward her and continued, "May every soldier who walks through these gates carry her spirit, the spirit of patience, humility, and unshakable honor." The crowd stood and clapped loudly. Maggie, feeling emotional, stepped forward. She didn't prepare a speech, but she spoke from her heart. "When I was young," she began, "I thought being brave meant never being afraid, but I learned that real bravery is being afraid and doing it anyway. I've made mistakes. I've lost people, but I never stopped believing in doing what's right." She paused for a moment, looking out at the faces of the young recruits. Someday, each of you will face your own battles, not all of them on a battlefield. Some will be inside you. Remember, strength doesn't mean being loud or fierce. It means being steady, kind, and true to your duty. Her words hung in the air like a promise. The crowd rose to their feet once more, giving her a long, heartfelt applause. After the ceremony, Hayes turned to her and said quietly, "You've built a legacy, Captain. This academy will train thousands of soldiers long after we're gone." Maggie smiled softly. "Then my mission is complete." As the sun began to set, she stood for a moment, watching the recruits march across the field. The sound of their boots echoed through the air, steady, strong, full of purpose. Years later, stories about Captain Maggie Dawson were still told in training halls and classrooms. Her photo hung in the academy's entrance, with a plaque beneath it that read, "She taught us that real strength is silent, steady, and born from the heart." Even after Maggie passed peacefully in her sleep many years later, her name continued to inspire new generations. Every soldier who trained at the Dawson Academy learned about the woman who had once been laughed at for her age, until a general saluted her in awe. And so, Maggie Dawson's legacy lived on. Not in medals, not in fame, but in the unbreakable spirit of every person who believed that true honor never fades, and courage has no age. Would you like me to create a complete YouTube video script, including narration, pacing, and emotional tone, for this full 8-part story next? It would sound cinematic and ready for storytelling voiceover.